Hey, Composing Gloves here. This is the 6th video in the FM8 from the ground up tutorial series, and today we're going to be covering the second part of the effects. Now, I'm going to try and be as clear as possible. There are a lot of little details here and things that just kind of get me. So just bear with me if I say something wrong. Just, drop in the comments, be like, hey, he's a little off here. But I stopped at Takwa in the first part because all these other ones use LFOs or feedback loops to accomplish what they do. So start off with a new sound, and we're going to start with the phaser. So I'm going to cover this pretty quick, and I'm going to use Harmer actually to cover the concept of a phaser. So there's two ways to accomplish a phaser. The first way is you have a signal, and it's represented here. And you can send a filter that takes out specific parts of that signal, and you can tell it to be automated so that it runs through at a rate. And you could tell it to go down here, then stop, and start back at the top and do it again at a particular rate. And you can send through 3 or 4 of these filters that only take out like a little bit. Like maybe your filter is made so it only takes out this section, this much, and that much runs through. And so if you can visualize that, if you can't, don't worry, I have a better visual right here. So we have a phaser right here, and we could set our width on how big we want it to be. So we're going to make it kind of small. And without the phaser on, we have this sound. And if we turn it on, it'll start applying those filters and telling it to run through the sound. And you can tell how fast with the speed. And that is pretty much all that's happening there. Now there are 2 ways to do this, as I said before. One is send that filter through with the really tiny envelope, or you can just phase invert it right there. It's called an all-pass filter. You could send several all-pass filters through there. And if you're familiar with bandwidth, which you should be because you watched my previous videos where you saw the letter Q, it has to do with Q, the width of your band. So if we changed our width gets changed, we get different behavior. And if we, okay, so we're all done with Harmer, just showing you what a phaser does. So we have our phaser here, and it does the same thing. Let's go to a different sound, a different waveform, so it's more clear what I'm doing. We have triangle, and it is being phased. So really, really fast. We're sending that through there really fast. And this rate right now is, I think it's per second, 100 times a second. Probably. I'm not sure what this is against. But if you turn the sync on, you'll notice first off that this yellow is turning on and off. This is saying I'm on, I'm off, I'm on, I'm off. And it's using an LFO to take in this information and turn on and off. Telling it when to apply the filters and when to not apply the filters. If you turn on the sync, this is now in some sort of ratio with the tempo of your DAW. So you can see it actually sped up quite a bit. If you slow it back down, it slows down barely. But if you want it to be in sync with your DAW somewhat, because again, it's just a ratio, you can do that. So that's an option, which is a pretty cool option because it's not something that I see on very many synthesizers. You generally just kind of have to eyeball the rate, and when you change your pitch, actually I'm not sure, I don't think pitch affects LFOs because it's taking an external LFO which you set by your rate. So anyways, now you have this invert. So what invert does is it phase shifts your sound. It phase shifts, it changes the phase of where your LFO starts. If you don't know what phase and LFO and all that stuff is, really quick, go look it up. Start it. My massive series, I cover it in there. But it changes the phase. The LFO tab video on the massive series covers this. And that of the LFO that's telling this thing to be modulated to send the low passes through. Alright, now you can have a whole bunch of filters, or you can have one. You can have up to 5. So you can hear all 5, and they come through one right after the other. I'm not sure how far apart they are, but you can do that. Now you have this color knob thing right here, which is a little misleading. It's essentially just a filter. We turn our LFO pretty much off. When you move it, it gets kind of weird. So it's just a filter. I think it's some sort of resonance filter. After that, you have your sweep minimum and your maximum. This sets the range of where you'll allow your phasers to go. So if we turn our phaser on and we change our sweep min, this will change the minimum value. So it can't go. And then the maximum, so it's being constrained to right about here if we go the other way around. So you're changing where it's allowed to phase. And then you have this rotate, which introduces a stereo signal, sending your phaser, altering it between the two speakers. You can see it represented here by the two different colors. And then you have your dry wet, which is the amount of the phaser that's applied. And it's that simple. So that is the phaser. Moving on to the flanger now. A flanger works with a feedback loop, but a lot of the principles are the same. So it takes your signal and reintroduces it into your signal, and that creates what's called flanging. Now there are two ways to do this. So the rate and the rate knob works the exact same way, and the sync does too, but it's being introduced at a rate, which is unusual for flanging. If you don't know very much about flanging, most flangers are what's called static. And so it's being introduced at that rate pretty much immediately. And you control the depth and color and other settings after. But this has an option to modulate it using an LFO, meaning put some in now, take some out, put some in now, put it back out, on, off, on, off, on, off. And so it's using an LFO to do that, and you can invert the LFO, which again changes the phase of the LFO, or the whole sync thing, which is the same as the flanger, and it works on the same principle, which is a really cool option for a flanger. So that's cool. We're going to stick it on static because this is typically on static, but some unique options there. So you have also this depth, which is basically where the content's allowed to affect spectral-wise. And you can see it move through the spectrum. And you have this color, which is again just a really light filter, almost not noticeable. And then you have rotate, which is the exact same thing, just a stereo. Oh, quick note about the rotate. Totally forgot. It doesn't work in static. Which I just demonstrated. The stereo, because it has to do with the LFO being routed between the two speakers. So if you have no LFO telling it to modulate, turn on and off, then it will not be sent to both speakers, and so rotate will do nothing, as you just saw. So basically when the LFO is at the peak of its value, sends it out one speaker, and when it's at the bottom, it sends it out the other. So that's what that does, and then you have your dry wet again. And that is the flanger. Moving on to the tremolo. Now, if you know what an actual tremolo is, it's basically a trill between chords, but this is a different kind of tremolo. This is basically a really fast volume automation. So if I were to hit multiple notes, it turns them on and off really fast. And the rate and sync work the same way, which is really nice that they have the same meaning. You have your intensity, which is basically, how big you want that cutoff to be, which you can hear right here, it gets choppier, or it could be a much smoother, smaller envelope. You're basically changing so if your LFO is like this, you're changing it to only go up and down that much, so it only changes the volume a little bit. Or you can just go straight on off. You can go stereo, which again, this is it'll stereo out your signal pretty much. You can change the width of that field. This is mono on the edges of your stereo field. You can change the attack. because so if you had a filter, let's go to filter Z. So here's our filter, and I just need you to visualize. All right, let's go to the envelope. This is basically your attack. So smoother attack, and then a very fast attack, and then the same with your decay. Much slower, longer decay. Or just lets go of it right when you have it. And if you're not familiar with the concept of a filter, when I hit my sound, it immediately turns on according to this filter, and it sustains, and then immediately it turns off, like click click, which isn't always desirable. So you move it like this, and now it goes wah, and then, but when I let go to like click, because I just turned it off. But if I let the decay out, it'll go wah, wah, like wah, the way you'd expect it to behave instead of the click. This is a very sharp filter, and so you're essentially controlling that with these right here on the sharpness of the tremolo of how fast you want the LFO to work. Then you have this reverb. Yeah, again, if you don't know what I'm talking about with LFO and feedback, my massive series has an LFO tab. Go check that out. And it also has a feedback discussion. Go check that out. It has its own filter effects, and I cover a lot of the same filters in there. These are slightly different. So the way reverb works is it takes your signal, and when a signal bounces off a lot of surfaces in a room, there are different stages. There are early refractions, there's mid refractions, mid-range, and then there's what's called regeneration or late refractions. Reverb takes those late refractions, which by this time there are like billions of them. They're coming at you from all sorts of different directions, and so you perceive a space. And by the length of this space of those refractions tells you how big this space is and a bunch of other stuff. Your ear's actually pretty incredible when it comes to this type of a thing. But that is how you perceive space. So that's what reverb is it takes that signal through a feedback loop that will reduce it to what would be like a reverb to us. And you can hear it come on after. You have your dry wet, you have a treble, which just it changes the decay length of the higher end of the spectrum. So if you turn it way down, you can hear that the high end does not last very long at all. In fact, I think that didn't last at all. So, and you have your bright, which is an EQ change to the reverb. So it's a difficult thing to hear if you don't know what you're listening for. But that's kind of what some producers, they add all these tiny effects and they add up over time. But the bright end of your reverb will be brought out, so the upper end, and then you have the amount of time that you want the tail to last. All the way up is really long, and then all the way short is nothing, which is you don't really have a reverb at that point. So that's what reverb does. All right, so let's go to the psych delay now. This thing is really cool. So essentially it's a stereo delay unit, and it's called psych delay, I believe, because it has an option to reverse the feedback. So it takes a sample of your sound, and then it plays it back through your speakers. And let's set everything back to, let's set this to 50, because I believe that's what opens up by default. But if you double click it, it goes to 0, which makes, we'll talk about that in a second. So you have psych delay, you have time, which is the amount of time it takes for the reverb to come out. As you can see, right now it's mono. You can tap your tempo for what you want. It'll average out your taps. So I'm right now hitting at a tempo that's 13. And so bigger values are much longer, shorter values are much shorter. You can seek it to your DAW though, which right now that's actually super fast. But now this acts as a ratio knob. Anyways, that's what it goes. I'm not going to talk about the ratios right now. There's feedback, which is the amount of reverb or delay, the amount of delay that's let back in. Let's make this faster. So you see it takes a much longer time to decay away. This is essentially the decay rate. And then you have reverse, so you can reverse your feedbacks. Check it out. So a really interesting option. You can reverse your feedback. All these other knobs have to do with the feedback. So if you're stereo, so right now it's mono, but if you go to full stereo, it's going to send it out your left, then your right, then your left, then your right. Or whichever one comes first, I don't know. This essentially controls the delay amount between the stereo field though. So how fast it comes out your left or right. So right now with it off, it's mono, so it comes out at the same time. But if you turn it on a little bit, you can hear it coming out both sides. And this controls the rate. So this comes out of left and right pretty like that. If you turn it up, it's much slower. And then the sync knob also affects that as well, so that can help fix rate problems if you're trying to make it match your tempo. But this is for stereo. You can detune your feedback. So that's your feedback only. And you can also change the pitch of it just completely. And you can detune that as well. So you see when you move it around, you get some sort of interesting sounds. And you have your wet dry as well. So that's the slight delay. I use my ear mostly when I'm doing this, and I usually put it on sync mode so that it'll match up with the song I'm working in. Great for trance and other things like that. All right, now let's cover the chorus delay. So we have our chorus delay right here. We turn it on, and right now nothing's on. If we play something, you can already hear a difference. Now the idea behind a chorus is a chorus / delay. This is actually a very unique chorus delay. If you have a choir and they're out there singing, everyone's going to sing the same pitch, but they're all going to be slightly off. No one's quite on it. Maybe one guy's on it, but everyone's trying to get there, but they're not quite there. As a result, you hear a very lush tone because their phases and everything of the waveforms they're generating don't quite line up, which you can hear on there. Now this time sets, so the way this works is it takes your signal and feedbacks it. So it takes it and pushes it back into itself, but it alters it a little bit via the settings we have here. And this time dictates the rate that it comes in. The reason this is unique is because, again, usually like the flanger, these things are static. But this one has an LFO telling it when to turn on and off. Right now it's at 0, so essentially it comes in immediately. But if we change that, you can hear the LFO telling it to turn on and off really fast, or telling the repeats, the time set between the repeats to change according to whatever algorithm they wrote. Turn it up a lot. You can hear that delayed signal takes a long time to get to us. You can sync it with your DAW just like anything else. And now this is in a ratio of it. And you can sync the delay. So after you have your initial one come in, you have this delay coming in. And when you sync the delay, as a result, that feedback becomes in phase. So you get some really unusual timbres. If you turn the feedback on, even more. Right now it was off, but it's still sending that first delay through. So if you feedback it, another feedback loop after the first one, which is like highly confusing, but that's why this chorus delay is so cool. You get even more, as you can see, weird stuff. So that's sync delay. If you turn that off though, then they're not going to be totally in phase with each other. Because the feedback is not obeying the same sync rule as our time. Because it's, just know that when you do that, the phases are off. And this is the main thing for the tempo of your DAW. For the feedback loop, that's how you sync that. Okay. You have this inversion which phase shifts the feedback coming in, and it will also stereo out your sound as a result. Which is the same as what the phaser would do. So I'm going to leave the sync on just for simplicity's sake. And we're going to turn the feedback off. So we get our typical chorus sound. That other stuff is sort of delay things. This diffusion spreads it out in the stereo field. So right now it's mono. Turn it on. Now it is stereo all the way. If we do it in conjunction with our sync delay, it gets even more weirdness, stereo stuff going on. We have our low cut, which cuts the low. It's a low pass filter to the feedback loop and all the delay and everything. But you see, we get some weird resonant stuff going on because apparently it stops right around here. And that's example of when you would use the panic button. So it starts feedbacking and self-oscillating, and I do not understand what just happened right there. If someone knows, you should tell me. Oh, it's because I had my feedback up to 100, so it just kept looping as the delay. So, yep, it's important to know what your feedback loops do. You don't want to set it to an infinite, unless you have some specific reason for doing that. So we have a low cut here. This low cut filter cuts the low end just like a low shelf would. So if we had our shelving EQ, it's essentially the same as doing this, but only to the feedback loop. And then the high cut does the opposite. It's essentially the same as doing this. So if we were to mess with that, only letting the high through, only letting the low through. So you could think of this as a high pass and a low pass, but they are different, opposite names. Feedback we already talked about is the amount of feedback after that initial delay that comes in. Mega weird. The mod rate is essentially the LFO rate, which is again affected by the sync button over here. It's changing the time setting we have here for the signal to be sent back in. You have your mod depth, how basically spectrally how far it's allowed to affect your sound. And you can see it happening. It's basically pitch modulation, frequency modulation. That's what it looks like. The algorithms probably aren't quite the same. And then you have your wet dry. I hope you understood that. This chorus delay is a powerful effect. For these delay effects, for any of these effects, I recommend experimenting because they're powerful when you combine them together and they can accomplish different things. And having an idea, because my goal isn't essentially to have you understand exactly what it's doing, but to get some sort of an idea of what it's doing. Because it's more powerful when you experiment with it and learn about what it does and what the reactions are, and you have some idea of what's going on. Because if you want to know exactly what it's doing, we're going to have to get into math, and that is just not as creatively engaging for some people as it is for others. So those are the effects. If you enjoy these tutorials, subscribe, and have a blessed day.